He planned the perfect anniversary surprise at a luxury Lagos suite, but when his wife walked in, she looked at him and said, "This suite was reserved for you." He never booked it. Minutes later, a video went viral, exposing a woman from his past and a son he never knew existed. Stay with me, because this Nigerian billionaire's secret is about to change everything. Chief Ethan Adeyemi was the kind of man Lagos respected without question. When his convoy of black SUVs moved through Ikoyi or Victoria Island, traffic instinctively gave way. At 48, he was one of Nigeria's most celebrated billionaires, a tech visionary who had expanded from fintech into renewable energy, oil logistics, and digital infrastructure. Newspapers called him self-made. Business magazines called him disciplined. Politicians called him strategic. On Banana Island, his mansion stood as proof that ambition could become architecture: glass walls, imported marble floors, a private dock facing the lagoon. To the public, his story was clean. Brilliant UNILAG graduate builds empire from nothing. To Ethan, the story had always been carefully edited. On the evening of his 20th wedding anniversary, he felt completely in control of his life. He had planned a surprise getaway for his wife, Lila Adeyemi. Lila was not impressed by wealth. She had married him when he still drove a used Toyota and worked from a cramped office in Yaba. She was raised in Enugu, grounded, principled, and emotionally perceptive in ways that sometimes unsettled him. Tonight, he wanted to impress her, not as a billionaire, but as a husband. The destination was a presidential suite at the Eco-Atlantic Grand Hotel, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Roses had been arranged. A private chef was on standby. A violinist would play softly once they arrived. Everything had been handled discreetly. As their driver pulled into the grand entrance, cameras flashed from a distance. Ethan stepped out confidently, adjusting his cufflinks. Lila followed in an emerald gown that made heads turn. "You really didn't need to do this," she said softly as they walked into the glowing marble lobby. "I wanted to," he replied with a smile that had convinced investors to sign multi-million naira deals. At the reception desk, the manager greeted him warmly. "Welcome back, Mr. Adeyemi." Ethan paused slightly. Back? He had attended conferences here, yes, but he had never stayed overnight. He dismissed the thought. The private elevator carried them directly to the presidential suite. When the doors opened, warm candlelight flickered against the walls. The Atlantic stretched endlessly beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. It was breathtaking. Lila stepped inside first. She walked slowly, observing every detail: the rose petals, the vintage champagne, the view. Instead of excitement, her expression shifted to something serious. On a glass table near the balcony rested a handwritten card. She picked it up. Read it carefully. Then she turned to Ethan, her face composed but unsettled. "Ethan, this suite was reserved for you." He frowned. "Of course it was. I booked it." She shook her head gently and handed him the card. "Welcome back, Mr. Adeyemi. As requested, everything has been prepared exactly as it was 20 years ago. Enjoy your evening." Ethan felt a sudden coldness in his chest. 20 years ago? That was impossible. "There must be a mistake," he said quickly. A knock interrupted them. A staff member entered carrying champagne. "We recreated everything just as you instructed when you booked earlier this year, sir," the man said respectfully. "We hope tonight is as special as a first." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. "I did not book this earlier this year," he replied, voice tightening. The staff member looked confused. "Sir, the suite was prepaid 6 months ago under your full legal name." 6 months ago, Ethan had been finalizing a solar energy contract in Abuja. He had not even discussed this anniversary plan until 3 weeks ago. Before he could respond, there was another knock. The staff member returned with a brown envelope. This was left with instructions to deliver once you arrived. Ethan opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph from 1998 at the University of Lagos. He recognized himself instantly, young, ambitious, unstoppable. Beside him stood a woman Lila had never seen before. Their arms were wrapped around each other, smiling like they shared something powerful. On the back of the photo were 4 words written in ink: "Some foundations crack later." Lila's voice was calm but steady. "Who is she?" Ethan stared at the image, and the name he had buried for 2 decades rose in his throat like confession. Clara and Naji. And just as silence filled the suite, both their phones began buzzing with notifications. A video was spreading across social media. The thumbnail showed Clara, older, composed, looking directly into the camera. The notifications multiplied within seconds. WhatsApp groups, Twitter, Instagram, business forums. Ethan's name was trending across Nigeria. Lila opened the link first. The video loaded slowly, buffering as thousands of viewers clicked simultaneously. When it began, Clara Naji appeared on the screen. She looked older but strong, her posture dignified, her eyes steady. "My name is Clara Naji," she began calmly. 28 years ago, I co-founded what you now know as Adeyemi Group." Ethan felt his throat tighten. Lila glanced at him but said nothing. Clara continued, her tone controlled, not emotional. She described studying computer science at UNILAG in the late 1990s, building financial tracking software during power outages, coding by generator light. Photos flashed on the screen, old lab rooms, floppy disks, notebooks filled with algorithm sketches. Then came images of her and Ethan presenting a prototype to early investors. "We were partners," Clara said, "equal partners." Ethan remembered those days vividly. Lagos was different then. Fewer tech hubs, more skepticism. Investors had laughed at the idea that young Nigerians could build scalable software. But Clara had been brilliant. Her algorithm optimized microloan tracking systems for small banks. It was revolutionary for its time. The video shifted tone. Clara displayed scanned documents, early CAC registration drafts listing both her name and Ethan's. When funding arrived, she said quietly, "My name disappeared." Ethan's breathing became shallow. Lila's grip tightened around her phone. Clara explained how an oil-connected investor had insisted on restructuring leadership. They believed investors would trust a male CEO more, she said without bitterness. Ethan agreed. The suite felt smaller, heavier. Lila finally spoke. "Is this true?" Ethan struggled. "It's complicated." Clara's voice continued through the speakers. "I confronted him when I discovered the changes. I was also pregnant at the time." Lila's head turned slowly toward Ethan. The silence between them was louder than the Atlantic waves crashing outside. Clara did not dramatize her pain. She simply laid out facts, emails, timestamp documents, messages where Ethan acknowledged restructuring. "I left Lagos shortly after," she said. "I raised my son alone." The word son echoed inside Ethan's skull. The video paused briefly before Clara delivered the final blow. "I never wanted his money. I wanted my name restored." Then a young man stepped into the frame. Tall, composed. His resemblance to Ethan was undeniable. The same sharp jawline, the same intense eyes. "My name is Daniel Naji," he said calmly. "I am 23 years old." Lila slowly lowered the phone. "Do you have a son?" she asked, voice steady but trembling underneath. Ethan swallowed hard. "I didn't know for sure." "Did you know she was pregnant?" Lila pressed. He hesitated. That hesitation answered everything. Outside, Lagos buzzed unaware that inside the presidential suite, an empire was beginning to fracture. Ethan could no longer hide behind silence. The past he had carefully archived began replaying vividly in his mind. It was 1998 at the University of Lagos. Nigeria was navigating economic uncertainty, and tech was barely taken seriously. Ethan had ambition. Clara had brilliance. They met during a programming competition when Clara corrected a logic flaw in his code without hesitation. He admired her immediately, not just her intelligence but her fearlessness. They began spending long nights in the computer lab, building software that could help microfinance banks track repayments efficiently. Power outages forced them to rely on generators. Sometimes they coded by candlelight in cramped dorm rooms. They dreamed of transforming Nigeria's financial system. When their prototype finally worked, they pitched it to small investors around Lagos. Many dismissed them. Some laughed outright. But one investor listened, a wealthy oil businessman looking to diversify into technology. He invited Ethan alone to a follow-up meeting. Clara had been busy preparing documentation. Ethan told himself it was harmless. The investor was direct. "You are sharp," the man said. But Nigerians are not ready to trust a company led by a woman in tech. Remove her from executive control, and I will fund you. Ethan had felt insulted initially, but the promise of millions clouded his judgment. He convinced himself he was protecting the company. He told himself Clara would understand later. Documents were altered, share structures redefined. By the time Clara saw the final registration papers, her ownership had been reduced to almost nothing. She confronted him outside the UNILAG faculty building during a humid afternoon. "You erased me," she said, holding the documents in her trembling hands. "It was strategic," Ethan replied defensively. "We'll fix it later." "You chose power over partnership," she shot back. That was when she told him she was pregnant. Ethan panicked. His career was just beginning. Investors were watching. Reputation mattered. He accused her of trying to trap him. The hurt in her eyes was something he would never fully forget. She left Lagos within weeks. He told himself she would call. She never did. Funding came through. Adeyemi Technologies was born. The company grew rapidly. Success drowned regret. Until now, standing in the presidential suite 20 years later, with Lagos social media exploding and his wife staring at him like she was seeing a stranger, Ethan finally understood something chilling. Some foundations do not crack immediately. They wait. And when they finally break, they do it publicly. The presidential suite felt suffocating after the video ended. Ethan's phone would not stop ringing. Board members, media houses, political contacts, investors from London and Dubai. He ignored every call. Lila stood near the balcony, staring at the Atlantic, her reflection faint against the glass. "Did you ever try to find her?" she asked quietly. Ethan hesitated. I sent someone to Enugu once. They said she had relocated." Lila turned slowly. "Or maybe you didn't look hard enough." Before he could respond, there was a knock at the suite door. The hotel manager stood outside, nervous. "Sir, your private rooftop dinner reservation is ready." Ethan frowned. "I didn't book dinner." The manager checked his tablet. "It was included in your original reservation request 6 months ago. Same instructions." Lila looked at him. "We should go." The rooftop lounge overlooked the entire eco-Atlantic skyline. The wind was strong, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. A single long table was set in the center, candles protected by glass cylinders. 2 figures were already seated. Clara and Naja looked thinner than in the video, but composed. Beside her sat Daniel. He rose when they approached. The resemblance was undeniable now under real light. Same height, same posture, same intense gaze. Ethan stopped walking. For the first time in decades, he did not know what to say. Clara broke the silence. "Good evening, Ethan." Her voice was calm, almost gentle. Lila remained slightly behind him, but close enough to show she was not retreating. "You reserved the suite," Ethan said finally. Clara nodded. "I knew you wouldn't agree to meet me otherwise." "You could have called," he replied, though the excuse sounded weak even to him. "I did," she said softly. 20 years ago." The wind howled between them. Daniel watched quietly, studying Ethan like a case study. Clara gestured to the empty seats. "Sit. Let's talk like adults." They sat today. The city lights flickered below. Clara placed a folder on the table and slid it toward Ethan. Inside were original coding drafts, early business plans in her handwriting, and email exchanges where Ethan acknowledged her contributions before investors entered the picture. "I kept everything," she said. "Not because I wanted revenge. Because I knew one day the truth would matter." Ethan looked at Daniel. "Why now?" Daniel answered calmly. "Because she's running out of time." Ethan's stomach tightened. Clara inhaled slowly. Stage 4 kidney disease. Dialysis buys time, not miracles. Lila's face softened despite everything. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Clara nodded in appreciation, but kept her focus on Ethan. "I never sued you. I never exposed you. I didn't want Daniel growing up under scandal. I wanted him to build his own name." Daniel spoke next. "I'm not here for your billions." His voice was steady. "I'm here because history should be accurate." The simplicity of that statement hit harder than any accusation. Ethan felt the weight of every award he had ever accepted. "What do you want?" he asked. Clara held his gaze. "Public acknowledgement. Legal restoration. My name as co-founder." Ethan knew what that meant. Board approval, equity redistribution, potential lawsuits, stock decline. Billions of naira could shift overnight. Lila looked at him, waiting. For the first time, the decision was not about strategy. It was about integrity. By morning, Nigeria had erupted. #Adiyemi scandal was trending across X. Arise TV ran special segments. Business Day published archived articles questioning early company records. Adiyemi Group stock dipped 12% before noon. Ethan arrived at the Victoria Island headquarters under heavier security than usual. Inside the executive boardroom, tension was thick. 12 board members sat around the polished mahogany table, legal advisors positioned behind them. "This is catastrophic," one director snapped. "If you admit this publicly, we open ourselves to shareholder lawsuits." Another added, "We can settle privately. NDA. Financial compensation. Make it disappear." Ethan listened quietly. His CFO slid a projection sheet forward showing potential losses if equity was restructured to recognize Clara's original 50% contribution before dilution. The numbers were staggering. "We have international investors," the legal advisor warned. "London will panic." Ethan thought about the rooftop dinner, about Daniel's calm voice, about Clara's thin frame against the Lagos skyline. "And if we deny it?" he asked. Silence. They all knew denial could work. Power often arrays inconvenient truths in Nigeria. But social media had changed the landscape. Documents were circulating. Former UNILAG classmates were speaking anonymously to bloggers. The story would not fade easily. "You built this company," one board member said carefully. "Don't destroy it over emotion." Ethan leaned back in his chair. For years he had justified his decision as necessary, strategic, temporary. But 20 years had passed. Temporary had become permanent. "Prepare the amendment," he said finally. The room froze. "Excuse me." "Begin the legal process to recognize Clara Naji as co-founder," Ethan repeated calmly. "We will restructure equity accordingly." The explosion of protest was immediate. "You can't be serious. This could cost billions. Investors will revolt." Ethan raised his hand. Silence slowly returned. "Then let them," he said. "I built this company with her. The truth is not optional." Later that evening, Ethan requested a private meeting with Daniel at a quiet lounge in Ikoyi. No media, no lawyers, just two men connected by blood and years of silence. Daniel arrived alone, dressed simply, confidence without arrogance. Ethan studied him carefully. "You're an engineer?" Ethan asked. "Mechanical," Daniel replied. "Graduated top of my class from University of Abuja." Pride flickered briefly in Ethan's chest before guilt replaced it. "Why didn't you reach out earlier?" he asked. Daniel held his gaze. "Because she asked me not to. She said you had chosen your path." The words were not bitter, just factual. Ethan inhaled slowly. "I didn't know for certain you existed." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "But you suspected." Ethan could not deny it. Years ago, a letter had arrived at his old Yaba office. Clara's handwriting was on the envelope. He never opened it. He had told himself it was manipulation. He had thrown it away unopened. "I was afraid," Ethan admitted quietly. Daniel nodded once. "Of responsibility. Of losing everything I was building." Daniel leaned back. "You built it anyway." The statement carried no admiration, just observation. Outside, Ikoyi traffic hummed. Inside, two lives recalibrated slowly. "I'm not asking you to be my father," Daniel continued. "I have one parent, and she's enough." The word struck Ethan deeply. "Then what do you want from me?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Do what is right, not what is convenient." Ethan felt something shift inside him, something he had suppressed since youth. Ambition had always guided his choices. This time, conscience was louder. As they stood to leave, Daniel paused. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I don't hate you." Ethan swallowed hard. I don't deserve that. Daniel met his eyes evenly. That's not for you to decide. And as Daniel walked away into the Lagos night, Ethan understood that restoring a name on paper would be easier than rebuilding something far more fragile, a chance, however small, at redemption. The announcement was scheduled for 4 p.m. at Eco Convention Center. By noon, media vans had lined the entire stretch of Ahmadu Bello Way. Bloggers, influencers, business correspondents, international press. Everyone wanted to witness what many call the biggest corporate reckoning in Nigerian tech history. Inside a private holding room, Ethan stood alone in front of a mirror. No speechwriter, no PR filter, just a simple prepared statement in his hand. For 20 years he had mastered control, controlled narratives, controlled interviews, controlled outcomes. Today there would be no control, only truth. His communications director entered nervously. "Sir, if you'd like to reconsider certain phrases, we can soften the liability exposure." Ethan shook his head. No softening. On the other side of the building, Clara watched from a quiet hospital room in Abuja. Dialysis tubes ran discreetly beneath her hospital gown. Daniel stood beside her, laptop open to the live stream countdown. Lila sat in the front row of the convention center, not as decoration, not as silent support, but as witness. When Ethan stepped onto the stage, the noise was deafening, camera shutters snapping, reporters shouting questions, lights blinding. He adjusted the microphone. For a brief second, his old instinct told him to protect the empire. Instead, he began calmly. 28 years ago at the University of Lagos, I co-founded a technology company with a woman named Clara Naji. The room went silent instantly. When early investors came in, I allowed her name and ownership to be removed from executive control. That decision was mine. Gasps rippled through the audience. It was wrong. The words hung in the air like something fragile but powerful. He did not blame investors. He did not dilute responsibility. He continued, explaining that legal amendments were being filed to formally recognize Clara Naji as co-founder of Adeyemi Group and to restore equity proportional to her original stake before dilution. Reporters began shouting again. How much will this cost? Will investors pull out? Is this an admission of fraud? Ethan did not flinch. This is an admission of truth. Across Nigeria, televisions froze on his face. Social media exploded again, but differently this time. Not outrage, shock, respect, debate. For once, a powerful Nigerian man had publicly admitted fault without being forced by court order. In the hospital room, Clara closed her eyes briefly, tears slipping down quietly. Daniel squeezed her hand. He did it, he whispered. Back at the convention center, a reporter asked the final question. Why now? Ethan paused before answering. Because integrity delayed is still integrity denied. And in that moment, whether his stock recovered or not, something inside him finally did. Markets reacted immediately. By the next morning, Adeyemi Group shares had dropped 18%. International analysts called the move financially reckless. WhatsApp investor groups buzzed with panic. London partners requested emergency calls. In the Victoria Island headquarters, the atmosphere was tense but strangely steady. The board members who had opposed Ethan now watched cautiously as public sentiment began shifting. Hashtags like #ClaraNaji and #Integrity and Leadership started trending. University students posted clips of the press conference praising accountability. Women in tech shared personal stories of being sidelined by male counterparts. What was supposed to be corporate suicide was becoming cultural momentum. Ethan sat in his office reviewing the amended CAC filings. Clara Naji, co-founder. The words looked simple but carried decades of weight. His CFO entered. So, surprisingly, retail investor confidence is stabilizing. Public trust metrics are improving. Ethan nodded slowly. And the foreign partners. Cautious, but watching. Meanwhile in Abuja, Clara's health declined slightly after dialysis complications. Daniel stepped outside the hospital for fresh air when his phone rang. It was Ethan. There was a long pause before Daniel answered. The paperwork is filed, Ethan said quietly. Your mother's name is officially restored. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Thank you. It was never charity, Ethan added. It was overdue. That evening, Lila visited Clara in the hospital. It was the first time the two women met alone. There was no hostility in the room, only a quiet recognition of shared history. Lila sat beside her bed. You were erased, Lila said softly. Clara gave a faint smile. Not anymore. Silence lingered gently between them. Did you love him? Lila asked carefully. Clara considered the question. Yes, but he loved ambition more at the time. Lila nodded slowly. He loves differently now. Clara's eyes softened. Good. Then maybe this story won't repeat itself. When Lila returned to Lagos that night, she found Ethan sitting alone on the balcony of their Banana Island home, staring at the water. She looks tired, Lila said gently. Ethan's voice was low. I wasted too much time. Lila stepped closer. Then don't waste what's left. 3 weeks later, Clara was moved into a quieter private care facility in Abuja. The doctors were honest with Daniel. There wasn't much time. Ethan flew in quietly, without press, without security spectacle. He walked into the room alone. Clara looked smaller now, but her eyes remained sharp. You always hated hospitals, she murmured faintly. Ethan managed a sad smile. I still do. He pulled a chair closer to her bed. For a moment, neither spoke. Years of silence filled the space between them. I read the amended documents, Clara said softly. You did it properly. It was yours, Ethan replied. It always was. She studied his face carefully, searching for the young man she once coded beside during power outages. Do you regret it? She asked. He didn't pretend not to understand. Every day. She nodded slowly, accepting the honesty. Regret doesn't change the past. No, he agreed quietly, but it can shape what's left of the future. Clara's breathing grew heavier for a moment before stabilizing. Daniel doesn't need your money, she said firmly. He needs your example. Ethan swallowed hard. I don't know if I'm worthy of that. Clara's eyes softened slightly. Then become worthy. The simplicity of her answer struck deeper than accusation ever could. Daniel stepped into the room quietly, giving them a moment before standing at the foot of the bed. Clara looked between them, the two men connected by blood, pride, and unfinished history. Don't let ego build walls again, she whispered weakly. Ethan nodded. I won't. Clara's gaze lingered on him one last time. You were brilliant, Ethan, just impatient. A faint smile touched her lips. Now you finally understand timing. He reached for her hand gently, something he had not done in nearly 3 decades. I'm sorry, he said, not as a billionaire, not as a public figure, but as a man who once made a choice out of fear. Clara squeezed his hand lightly. I know. Outside the window, Abuja's evening sky turned gold. Inside the room, silence settled, not heavy, not bitter, but peaceful. For the first time since that afternoon at UNILAG, there were no accusations left, no documents to reveal, no headlines to chase. Just truth. And sometimes, truth, though delayed, arrives exactly when it must. Clara passed away at dawn 3 days later. Abuja woke up to soft harmattan light, unaware that one of the quiet architects of Nigeria's tech revolution had taken her last breath. Daniel was holding her hand when the machines went still. There were no dramatic final words, no cinematic speeches, just a slow exhale and a peace that settled across her face like rest finally owned. Ethan arrived an hour later. He stood at the doorway before stepping in, as though crossing an invisible boundary between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. Daniel looked up at him, eyes red but steady. No anger, no collapse, just gravity. Ethan approached the bed and stared at Clara's face. For years, success had drowned out memory. Now memory was all that remained. I'm sorry, he whispered again, though apology now felt both necessary and insufficient. The news broke by midday, not through scandal blogs, not through gossip platforms, but through a formal statement from Adeyemi Group. Clara Naji, co-founder, visionary engineer, pioneer in financial technology, passed away peacefully in Abuja. The word co-founder echoed across headlines nationwide. Arise TV aired a special tribute segment. Former UNILAG classmates began sharing old photos online. Female tech founders posted messages calling her a silent trailblazer. For the first time in decades, her name was not a footnote. It was central. The funeral was held in Enugu, private but dignified. No political spectacle. No excessive display. Just family, a few close friends, former classmates, and surprisingly, several young women from tech startups who had never met Clara but felt they owed her something. Ethan attended without convoy drama, wearing plain black traditional attire. Whispers followed him, but not the kind he was used to. These were not whispers of admiration or suspicion. They were whispers of consequence. Daniel stood beside the casket, composed in a way that mirrored his mother. During the brief eulogy, he spoke without notes. "My mother believed in building quietly," he said. "She believed recognition was secondary to impact. But today, I am grateful she is recognized." His eyes flickered briefly toward Ethan, not accusing, not forgiving, simply acknowledging. When the ceremony ended, Ethan remained behind after most guests had left. He stood before the lowered casket as workers prepared the grave. "You were right," he murmured softly. "Timing matters." And for the first time in his adult life, Chief Ethan Adeyemi felt small in a way that had nothing to do with money. Grief did not trend on social media the way scandal did, but it moved quietly through Nigeria's tech community. University panels began discussing ethical co-founding structures. Podcasts debated gender equity in African startups. Adeyemi Group stock, which had initially dipped, began stabilizing, not because investors forgot, but because the market sensed something rare: accountability. Back in Lagos, Ethan returned to work with a different posture. The boardroom felt different now, less intimidating, more honest. He initiated structural reforms within the company, mandatory equity transparency clauses, third-party oversight for startup acquisitions, mentorship programs for female engineers. Some executives resisted quietly, but the culture had shifted. Daniel returned to Abuja after the funeral, focusing on his engineering consultancy projects. He declined media interviews, declined invitations to sit on Adeyemi Group's board despite now legally holding significant shares. Ethan called him one evening. "You don't have to distance yourself," Ethan said carefully. Daniel's response was calm. "I'm not distancing. I'm building." There was something powerful in that statement. Daniel did not want inheritance handed down as compensation for guilt. He wanted independence. Weeks later, Ethan visited him in Abuja, not as CEO, not with lawyers, just as a man carrying takeout food from a local restaurant Daniel liked. They sat in Daniel's modest apartment, a sharp contrast to Banana Island luxury. "Your mother coded her first prototype on a generator that overheated every hour," Ethan said quietly, almost smiling at the memory. Daniel listened. "She told me stories," he replied. "She never painted you as a villain." That struck Ethan deeply. "I didn't deserve that mercy," he admitted. Daniel shrugged lightly. "She believed bitterness wastes intelligence." Silence lingered, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was building something slow and unfamiliar. "I don't expect you to call me father," Ethan said finally. Daniel met his eyes. "Titles aren't important. Consistency is." And in that moment, Ethan understood that rebuilding trust would not happen through grand gestures or press conferences. It would happen through repeated, quiet presence. 3 months after Clara's passing, Ethan organized another press conference, but this one felt different. No scandal, no defense, just intention. Standing before journalists again, he announced the launch of the Clara Naji Innovation Initiative, a 25 billion Nigerian naira fund dedicated to supporting female tech founders across Nigeria who lacked access to capital due to structural bias. The fund will provide seed investment, legal protection for equity agreements, and technical mentorship networks in Lagos, Abuja, and Enugu. Innovation should never depend on gender, Ethan stated firmly, and no founder should disappear from their own creation. The announcement sparked national conversation again, but this time fueled by inspiration rather than shock. Universities reached out for partnerships. Young women flooded application portals. International investors who had once panicked now expressed renewed interest, impressed by the long-term brand integrity strategy. But for Ethan, it wasn't strategy anymore. It was repair. That evening, he visited Clara's gravesite quietly during a trip to Enugu. The air was still. He placed a simple bouquet of white flowers on the grave. "Your name will outlive mine," he said softly. Back in Lagos, Lila watched him carefully over the following weeks. She saw the subtle changes, the way he listened longer in meetings, the way he paused before making decisions, the way he no longer dismissed uncomfortable truths quickly. One night on their Banana Island balcony, she spoke gently. "Do you feel lighter?" Ethan considered the question. "Not lighter," he replied honestly, "but clearer." Lila nodded. "Clarity is heavier at first." He looked out over the lagoon, reflecting city light shimmering across water. 4 decades he had chased expansion, more contracts, more influence, more visibility. Now he was learning contraction, shrinking ego, shrinking pride, shrinking the distance between who he was publicly and privately. In Abuja, Daniel submitted his company proposal to partner with a renewable infrastructure project, coincidentally one owned by Adeyemi Group. He did not request favoritism. He submitted it through proper channels. When Ethan saw the proposal land on his executive desk weeks later, he smiled slightly but passed it to independent review without comment. If Daniel was going to earn his place, it would not be through quiet bias. It would be through merit. And as Nigeria's tech ecosystem quietly evolved, more cautious, more transparent, more inclusive, one truth became undeniable. Some foundations crack later, yes. But if rebuilt correctly, they can become stronger than the original design. The proposal sat on the executive review table inside Adeyemi Group's headquarters in Victoria Island. It was one among dozens submitted for the company's new renewable microgrid expansion across northern Nigeria. No special markings, no executive notes, just a standard application under the name Naji Engineering Solutions. Ethan stared at the document for a few seconds longer than necessary before sliding it toward the independent review committee. "Evaluate it like every other submission," he said firmly. "No favoritism, no interference. If Daniel was going to stand in any room connected to Adeyemi Group, it would be because he earned it." Weeks passed. The evaluation team scored proposals blindly, removing company names and reviewing only technical strength, feasibility, cost efficiency, and scalability. When the final rankings came back, one proposal stood at the top by a significant margin. Innovative turbine redesign, lower maintenance cost, higher rural adaptability, efficient local material sourcing. The review chairman walked into Ethan's office. "The highest scoring proposal is from a relatively small firm based in Abuja," he said. "Naji Engineering Solutions." Ethan allowed himself a slow exhale. Not pride, not relief. Something steadier. "Award the contract," he replied simply. No announcement. No internal memo explaining connections. Just merit recognized. When Daniel received the official approval email, he read it twice before believing it. He knew the evaluation process had been blind. He knew Ethan had not intervened. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel something unfamiliar toward the man who shared his blood, respect forming quietly where resentment could have lived. That evening, Daniel called Ethan. "We got the contract," he said, voice control but unable to hide the edge of satisfaction. "Congratulations," Ethan replied. No claim of involvement, no paternal tone, just acknowledgement. There was a pause before Daniel added, "Thank you for not interfering." Ethan understood the weight behind those words. "Earned success lasts longer," he said softly. And somewhere between Lagos and Abuja, a new kind of foundation began forming, not built on erased names or silent guilt, but on own ground. Success in business did not erase the tension at home. One night in Banana Island, after another long day of meetings and media interviews about the Clara Naji initiative, Lila finally spoke what had been sitting quietly inside her. "I need to know something," she said as they sat across from each other in the dimly lit living room. Ethan looked up from the documents in his hand. "Anything." "If this never came out," she said carefully, "would you have told me?" The question did not sound accusatory. That made it more powerful. Ethan lowered the papers slowly. Honesty had become his new discipline. "No," he admitted. The air between them shifted. Lila nodded once, absorbing the truth. That's what hurts, she said. Not Clara, not even Daniel. It's that you were willing to let me live beside a version of you that wasn't complete. Ethan felt the weight of that more than any boardroom confrontation. I thought protecting the past were protecting us, he said quietly. You were protecting yourself, she corrected gently. Silence stretched. The ocean outside reflected city lights like scattered glass. Do you love her? Lila asked finally. Ethan didn't rush the answer. I loved who we were before ambition changed me, he said honestly. But I love you differently. Fully, with understanding I didn't have then. Lila studied his face carefully. She had built 2 decades of life with this man. Shared struggles, shared triumphs, shared silence. Marriage isn't about never failing, she said slowly. It's about not hiding the failure. He moved closer to her. No more shadows, he promised. She held his gaze. If I ever sense one again, I won't stay. It wasn't a threat. It was clarity. And for the first time since the presidential suite night, their marriage felt fragile, but honest. Not polished. Not perfect. Real. 6 months after Clara's passing, the first Clara Naji Innovation Summit was held in Lagos. Hundreds of young female founders gathered in a packed auditorium. Some wore anchor blazers over jeans. Others carried laptops plastered with startup stickers. The energy in the room was electric, ambition without apology. Ethan stood backstage, listening as speakers discussed equity protection clauses and intellectual property rights. He heard Clara's philosophy in every conversation. Build boldly, document everything. When he finally stepped onto the stage, he did not open with statistics. He opened with a story. In 1998, a brilliant engineer taught me that ideas mean nothing if integrity does not protect them, he said. The audience listened closely. He did not paint himself as hero. He positioned himself as caution. If you build something, he continued, fight to keep your name attached to it. And if you are ever in a position of power, remember that success built on erasure eventually collapses. The applause was not thunderous. It was thoughtful, respectful. After the summit ended, as attendees networked and exchanged ideas, Daniel walked quietly into the hall. He had come unannounced. He stood at the back, observing the banner bearing his mother's name in bold letters. Ethan noticed him from across the room. Their eyes met. No dramatic music. No cinematic embrace. Just recognition. Daniel approached slowly. She would have liked this, he said. Ethan nodded. It should have happened sooner. Daniel glanced around at the young founders pitching ideas confidently. Maybe, he said, but if it happened sooner, it wouldn't have meant the same thing. That sentence lingered between them. Timing again. Outside, Lagos traffic moved in its usual chaos. Inside the hall, something orderly and powerful was unfolding, a generation learning from a mistake that had once almost destroyed an empire. As father and son stood side by side, not fully reconciled, not perfectly bonded, but no longer divided, Ethan understood something with absolute clarity. Wealth can build towers, but truth builds legacy. And legacy, once corrected, outlives even regret. Success stories travel fast in Nigeria, but so does resistance. 3 weeks after the Clara Naji Innovation Summit, Adeyemi Group faced its biggest external threat yet. An international investment consortium based in London announced a strategic reassessment of its partnership with the company, citing governance instability following the public equity restructuring. Financial analysts on global networks began questioning whether Ethan's moral repositioning had compromised shareholder security. By Monday morning, the company's stock dipped again, this time not because of scandal, but because global capital feared unpredictability. Inside the Victoria Island headquarters, tension returned to the boardroom. We warned you, one director said bluntly. Emotion-driven decisions destabilize markets. Another added, we are now seen as ideologically driven instead of financially disciplined. Ethan listened quietly, fingers folded on the polished table. Months earlier, he might have responded defensively, citing growth charts and future projections. Now he responded differently. Integrity is not ideology, he said evenly. It is risk management. The room fell silent. He continued, explaining that international markets were not punishing transparency, they were reacting to uncertainty, and uncertainty could be managed with clarity. He proposed a global investor briefing, full disclosure of governance reforms, independent auditing oversight, and a forward-looking expansion roadmap led by diverse executive leadership. We show them that ethical correction strengthened us, he concluded, not weakened us. The strategy rolled out swiftly. Within 2 weeks, Ethan was on a video call with investors across Europe and North America. He did not frame Clara's recognition as charity or apology. He framed it as structural correction that eliminated future legal vulnerabilities and reputational risk. Numbers spoke louder than emotion. Profit margins had stabilized. New youth-driven market segments were engaging with the brand. Applications to work at Adeyemi Group had increased by 40% since the reforms. Something unexpected happened. Foreign investors began to view the company as forward-thinking rather than unstable. ESG rating agencies upgraded Adeyemi Group's ethical governance score. What critics labeled weakness started becoming leverage. Back in Lagos, Lila observed Ethan carefully. She noticed how differently he carried pressure now. Before, stress made him colder, more distant. Now it made him deliberate. One evening, as they sat overlooking the lagoon, she said quietly, "You're not fighting to protect ego anymore." He smiled faintly. Ego is expensive. Meanwhile in Abuja, Daniel's engineering team successfully completed the first phase of the Northern Microgrid project ahead of schedule. Rural communities that once depended on noisy diesel generators now had stable electricity for clinics and schools. Daniel visited one of the sites personally. When villagers thanked him, he deflected praise toward his team. Leadership without noise. Clara's influence lived in that restraint. News outlets began covering the success of the project, highlighting that it was executed by a young engineering firm led by Clara Naja's son. The narrative was shifting again, not scandal, not redemption, but generational continuity. One afternoon, Ethan received an unexpected invitation from a federal regulatory council requesting his presence at a closed-door policy discussion on startup equity protection laws. Years ago, such an invitation would have inflated his pride. Now it felt like responsibility. During the session in Abuja, policymakers debated introducing mandatory founder equity disclosure structures for early-stage Nigerian startups. Ethan spoke carefully, not as a savior, but as a cautionary example. Power imbalance at the beginning creates conflict at the peak, he said. Protect founders early. Weeks later, draft legislation began circulating informally within tech circles. Clara's story, once almost erased, was influencing policy reform. At home, Ethan stood in his study one night staring at an old frame magazine cover declaring him Nigeria's most disciplined entrepreneur. He removed it from a wall and replaced it with a simpler frame, a photo from the Clara Naji Innovation Summit showing dozens of young female founders raising their hands during a Q&A session. When Lila walked in, she noticed a change. "You're editing the narrative," she said gently. "No," he replied. "I'm correcting it." The market eventually stabilized fully. International investors who had hesitated renewed long-term agreements. Adeyemi Group's valuation recovered, this time supported not only by profit metrics but by governance credibility. But the greatest shift wasn't financial, it was internal. Ethan no longer measured strength by dominance. He measured it by alignment. And alignment, he was learning, attracted stability in ways intimidation never could. Not all healing happens publicly. Some of it unfolds quietly in rooms without cameras. One evening, Daniel invited Ethan to dinner in Abuja, not at a luxury restaurant, but at a modest local spot Clara used to like. Plastic chairs, grilled fish, minimal attention. Ethan arrived without security spectacle, dressed simply. They sat across from each other as traffic noise hummed outside. "Why here?" Ethan asked gently. Daniel glanced around. She liked places that didn't pretend. They ordered food. For a few minutes, conversation stayed neutral. Project timelines, engineering setbacks, expansion plans. Then Daniel leaned back slightly. "I've been thinking about something," he said. Ethan waited. "When she told you she was pregnant, were you afraid of being a father or of losing control?" The question was direct but not hostile. Ethan didn't rush his answer. "Both," he admitted. I equated responsibility with limitation. Daniel studied him. And now? Ethan exhaled slowly. Now I understand that avoiding responsibility limited me more. The honesty shifted something subtle in the air. Daniel nodded slightly. I used to imagine confronting you angrily, he confessed. But when I saw how you handled the press conference, anger felt unnecessary. Ethan looked down briefly. I deserved anger. Maybe, Daniel replied calmly, but she didn't want me carrying it. They ate quietly for a moment. The simplicity of the setting removed pretense. I'm not ready to call you father, Daniel said finally. I don't need that title, Ethan replied. I just need the opportunity to show up. Daniel held his gaze. Consistency, he repeated. Consistency, Ethan agreed. After dinner, they walked outside. Abuja's night air was cooler than Lagos. There's something else, Daniel said, hesitating slightly. My company is expanding. We're opening a Lagos branch. Ethan's expression shifted subtly. That's good. I'm not asking for partnership, Daniel clarified quickly. I'm informing you. A faint smile touched Ethan's face. I wouldn't expect anything less. It was a small exchange, but it marked progress, not reconciliation, not full acceptance, but movement. As Daniel drove away that night, Ethan stood under dim streetlight and realized something important. Fatherhood was not a role you claimed. It was one you earned slowly, without entitlement. And for the first time in his life, he was willing to earn something without demanding immediate return. 1 year after the night in the presidential suite, Lagos felt different. Or perhaps Ethan felt different within it. Adeyemi Group had completed its renewable expansion successfully. The Clara Naji Innovation Initiative had funded 32 female-led startups across Nigeria, 2 of which were already scaling regionally. Daniel's engineering firm had secured independent contract beyond Adeyemi Group, proving sustainability beyond connection. The narrative had matured. What began as scandal had evolved into structural change. On the anniversary of Clara's passing, Ethan traveled quietly to Enugu alone. No press, no announcement. He stood before her grave holding a simple bouquet again. You said timing matters, he murmured softly. I'm still learning. The wind moved gently through the trees. There was no dramatic sign, no symbolic moment, just quiet acknowledgement. Later that evening, he returned to Lagos and found Lila waiting on the balcony of their home. She had lit small candles along the railing. For reflection, she said softly. They stood together watching the lagoon shimmer. Do you regret the way everything happened? She asked. Ethan considered carefully. I regret the delay, he answered, but not the correction. Lila nodded slowly. Growth rarely feels convenient. He turned toward her fully. Thank you for staying. She met his eyes steadily. I didn't stay for comfort. I stayed for truth. That distinction mattered. Days later, Adeyemi Group hosted its annual corporate gala, this time with a significant change. Instead of highlighting profit milestones first, the opening presentation showcased impact metrics, rural electrification numbers, startup equity protection frameworks, mentorship outcomes. Clara's photo appeared on the large screen alongside the words, co-founder, engineer, pioneer. The applause was steady, respectful. Daniel attended quietly, standing at the back once again. But this time, when Ethan noticed him, he didn't simply nod. He gestured subtly toward an open seat near the front. Daniel hesitated only briefly before walking forward and sitting, not beside Ethan, but with invisible acknowledgement. It wasn't symbolic perfection. It was progress. Later that night, after guests departed and the ballroom emptied, Ethan stood alone for a moment on the stage where he had once built narratives of dominance. Now he understood something deeper. Legacy is not the absence of mistakes. It is the courage to correct them publicly and live differently afterward. As he stepped down from the stage, Lila joined him, slipping her hand into his. This time, she said quietly, the foundation feels solid. Ethan looked around the hall, then at Daniel speaking with young engineers across the room. This time, he agreed, it's honest. And in a country where power often silences accountability, honesty had become the strongest asset he owned. Exactly 1 year after the night that fractured his world, Ethan Adeyemi made another reservation at the Eco-Atlantic Grand Hotel. This time, there was no mystery booking, no hidden instructions, no envelope waiting on a glass table. He called personally. "I want the presidential suite," he said calmly. "And this time, I'm the one reserving it." The manager recognized his voice instantly. "Of course, sir." No recreations, Ethan added firmly. No references to the past. Just a simple setup. When he hung up, he felt something unexpected. Peace. Not because everything had been repaired perfectly, but because nothing was hidden anymore. Lila agreed to the weekend stay without hesitation. She understood the symbolism. Some places must be revisited, not avoided, if healing is real. The evening they arrived, there were no camera flashes. Ethan had declined publicity. They walked through the lobby quietly, side by side. The same marble floors, the same golden lighting. But this time, when the receptionist said, "Welcome, Mr. Adeyemi," there was no welcome back. No hidden weight in the words. The elevator opened into the presidential suite once again. Candlelight glowed softly, but not excessively. No dramatic romance staging. Just elegance. Lila stepped inside slowly, scanning the room just like she had a year ago. She turned to him. "You reserved this one yourself?" she asked. Ethan met her eyes. "Yes." She nodded, satisfied. "Good." He walked toward the balcony and opened the glass doors. The Atlantic breeze flowed in, strong and steady. Lagos shimmered below, busy, loud, alive. A year ago, this view had felt like judgment. Tonight, it felt like witness. There was a knock at the door. Ethan opened it himself. Daniel stood there, hands casually in his pockets. No tension, no surprise. He had been invited. "I hope I'm not late," Daniel said. "You're right on time," Ethan replied. The three of them sat at a round dining table near the window. No reporters, no board members, just quiet dinner. Conversation flowed naturally at first. Daniel spoke about expanding his engineering firm into Ghana. Lila shared updates about a mentorship network she had started for young women in Enugu. Ethan listened more than he spoke. At one point, Daniel looked around the suite thoughtfully. "So this is where it all started coming undone," he said lightly. Ethan didn't avoid it. "Yes." Daniel nodded slowly. Strange how collapse can create clarity. Lila smiled faintly. "Only if you choose it." There was silence for a moment, not uncomfortable, just reflective. Then Ethan stood and walked toward a small side table near the wall. He picked up a framed photograph and brought it to the center of the dining table. It was an edited version of the old UNILAG graduation photo. Clara stood in the middle this time, exactly where she had always belonged. Ethan and Clara on either side. Youthful, ambitious, unaware of how complicated life would become. Daniel studied the image carefully. His jaw tightened briefly, but not with anger, with recognition. "She'd argue about the color correction," he said quietly. Lila laughed softly. "Perfectionist." "Always," Daniel replied. Ethan looked at the photo for a long moment. "I used to think success meant never being challenged," he said thoughtfully. "Now I know it means surviving correction." Daniel met his eyes across the table, not as a son seeking approval, not as a stranger demanding justice, but as a man evaluating another man's consistency. "You've been consistent this year," Daniel said finally. Ethan didn't smile widely. He simply nodded. That acknowledgement meant more than applause ever had. After dinner, they moved toward the balcony. The city stretched endlessly. Boats moved like tiny lights across dark water. Lila stood between them, looking out at Lagos. "This suite," she said quietly, "wasn't cursed." Ethan glanced at her. "No." She shook her head. It was waiting. Waiting for truth. Waiting for confrontation. Waiting for growth. Months later, Nigeria's National Assembly passed new startup equity protection guidelines influenced by corporate case studies, including Adeyemi Group's restructuring. Clara Naja's story was referenced in policy discussions as an example of why early-stage founder protections mattered. Universities began teaching it in entrepreneurship courses, not as gossip, not as scandal, As curriculum, the Clara Naji Innovation Initiative expanded beyond Nigeria, funding female-led startups in Kenya and Rwanda. Daniel's engineering firm secured international contracts without leveraging his surname. He rarely used Adeyemi publicly. He built Naji deliberately. Ethan watched from a distance, resisting the urge to intervene, proud in a quiet, disciplined way. At home in Banana Island, the mansion no longer felt like a monument to dominance. It felt lived in. Honest. Lila's mentorship program had grown steadily, connecting young women in eastern Nigeria with tech incubators in Lagos. Sometimes, in the evenings, Ethan would sit alone in his study, not reviewing profit charts, but reading applications from young founders describing dreams that reminded him painfully of 1998. He made it a habit to personally respond to at least one letter every week. Not with corporate language, with mentorship. One evening, nearly 18 months after the presidential suite revelation, Daniel visited unexpectedly. He stood in the study doorway. "I signed a major cross-border contract today," he said. Ethan stood up immediately. "That's excellent." Daniel hesitated briefly before adding, "I thought you should hear it from me." That was the moment. Small, quiet, but heavy with meaning. "I'm proud of you," Ethan said, carefully, sincerely. Daniel held his gaze for a few seconds. "Thank you." It wasn't dramatic reconciliation. It wasn't a cinematic embrace. It was something more realistic, earned trust building brick by brick. Later that night, as Daniel prepared to leave, he paused near the front door. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. Ethan waited. "I may not be ready for certain titles," Daniel continued, "but I'm open to building something steady." Ethan nodded once. Steady is enough. When the door closed behind Daniel, Ethan stood still for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. Redemption had not restored youth. It had not erased regret, but it had built something forward-facing. He stepped onto the balcony where Lila was waiting. Lagos lights reflected across the lagoon like scattered stars. "Do you ever think about that first night here?" she asked quietly. He did. "Often." "Yes," he replied, "but it doesn't haunt me anymore." She leaned into him slightly. "Why?" He looked out over the city he had once tried to conquer. "Because the foundation isn't cracking anymore. Some stories go viral because of scandal. Some endure because of truth. Ethan Adeyemi had built towers, signed contracts, shaken hands with presidents. But the strongest thing he ever built was invisible, an honest legacy corrected in time. And somewhere beyond the noise of Lagos traffic and market fluctuations, beyond headlines and boardrooms, one simple sentence remained quietly powerful. This time, he made the reservation himself.